We've been in this series called ETHOS, an exploration of values that have immense power and potential to transform the way that we move through the world. And so we've covered some different sacred values over the past handful of weeks. We've talked about grit, how we persevere through the difficulties of life. We talked about boundaries, how a boundaried life is a sustainable one. And then last week we talked about enthusiasm. So we talked about really we're on this journey, and then sometimes we're wondering where do we want to point ourselves towards? And sometimes it's exploring that which calls to us and our deepest enthusiasm and our deepest joy and excitement that could be a compass for us. So we've been kind of building each value upon the next. And where we're at today is a value that really is there to aid us and assist us when we face the natural challenges of life. That we go on this journey, and of course, there are going to be disruptions. There are going to be things that stand in our way. There's going to be wind. And so today's value, which you might have already guessed, is flexibility. Flexibility. Now, of course, today we're going to be talking about the spiritual aspect of flexibility. But I should also acknowledge the fact that when we say flexibility, what probably comes to mind for you is the physical side of flexibility. And I just need to be honest and say that when it comes to the physical side of flexibility, I am not the person to be speaking about this. This is what I think of when I think, like, oh yeah, good stretch. I'm like the least flexible person I know. And I have a memory going far back, really, that cemented my understanding of myself as an inflexible person. When I was in junior high, we did this thing once a year called the Presidential Physical Fitness Testing. Does anyone remember this? I found out it's been going on since the 1950s, so most of you probably would recognize this. And essentially, just to recap, this was a test that they did where they came into the school and they basically said, like, how fit are all these kids? Which I think is just an interesting, I don't know what they were trying to figure out anyway. But they put us through all these different challenges, like running the mile and how many pull-ups can you do? And I took this really seriously because I thought the president is watching. Like one day the president is just going to get my scores passed on to the Oval Office. There at the Resolute desk, he's like, all right, we're going to be okay, And so I remember specifically, though, there was a flexibility challenge, and it was like, how can you touch your toes when you're sitting down? And I failed this. I failed it fully. And I remember thinking, and I had pretty much failed everything else. So I remember thinking, like, the president is not going to be happy with me. And a couple months later, they posted the scores for everyone to see, which is really nice, by the way, right? So then I go and I look and I go to check my scores, and it says that I passed every test with flying colors. And I thought, this is impossible because I know I didn't, so this must be a case of mistaken identity or something. And I later figured out, see, in school, when I was young, I had asthma, and I was like registered as having asthma with the school. And so I figured out that because I had asthma, they just passed me on everything. They're like, hey, he's fine. Like he's struggling. Let's just be nice. Full pass, flying colors, So what I really walked away from that is that I'm not flexible. That was the big, takeaway. And I've looked at people who are very physically flexible with, some sense of envy. I think it's such an amazing skill. Like, for example, you go to a yoga class, you see someone who's really flexible, and you're like, man, I wish I could do that. And then you realize that people who are really experienced yogis, even they have people who they look to that are even more flexible than them. We call these people contortionists, right? Which, although impressive, I feel like based on the look on this guy's face, this is not how a human body should be positioned. Of course, very few of us are ever that flexible physically. But I do believe that we can strive for a spiritual flexibility that I find to be essential in this world that is changing constantly, and essential in this life that is naturally going to throw disruptions at us, and really essential if we would like to walk through this world, which we cannot control, which we cannot change, but we can control and change ourselves and perhaps have a deeper sense of ease throughout our lives. A few months ago, Olivia and I had the opportunity to travel to Bolivia in South America, and we were going on a retreat. And the leader of this retreat has lived both in North America and Bolivia for the past 20 years. So he goes, every year he's constantly going back and forth between the two. And he said this as we were preparing to make the long, arduous trip down to the middle of South America. He said, "Here is my motto for traveling to Bolivia." He said, "Be flexible or be miserable." Can you say that with me now? Be flexible or be miserable. And basically what he was saying is, look, this is a country that it just isn't going to operate by the same rules that you're used to in your country. So can you come in with an open-mindedness and an open-heartedness, right? And instead of just being frustrated at everything that doesn't go the way you think it's supposed to go, have some flexibility. But if we're honest with ourselves, how often is it that it's our inflexibility that causes the misery in life, right? And travel is just one of many examples where when we show up rigid, when we show up inflexible, we just end up really frustrated. And a big part of this is because our expectations tend to guide us, and our expectations by their nature are very rigid. Our expectations lead us to say things like, well, they were supposed to do this, or this was not supposed to happen this way. And the more tightly we hold on to our expectations, the greater the shock when things don't follow our expectations. But I think we know deep down that our expectations are really a false sense of security. And there's many things, in fact, that we have a false sense of security in, right? Sometimes our beliefs can offer us a false sense of security. The amount of money that we have, the things that we have, our achievements, these all offer us this illusion of control. And the reason I say it's false is because really we know that these things can be torn away pretty quickly. And I don't just mean by death or loss, but even just we enter into situations and circumstances that equalize us. And a great example of this, again, to go back to travel, is an airplane, right? I've been noticing there are more and more videos popping up lately of people getting super angry on airplanes and then thrown off the airplane and then probably put on the no-fly list for life. Has anyone seen any of these videos? Just me? Okay. I don't know. It's a weird obsession I have. But I think, I have a theory, and I have a theory that the reason that people tend to get so riled up on an airplane is because it's one of those places, it's one of those spaces in life where your achievements, your expectations, no matter how much money you have, no matter your status, everyone is in the same boat, nearly literally. It's just a sky boat, right? But everyone is in the same situation, and everyone is really at the mercy of the crew. And this lack of control, I think, can lead to some of our most destructive and kind of disastrous behavior. But here's the reality. We are all on the airplane of life, okay? We're flying around on spaceship Earth, and the reality is that we don't have much control either, just the illusion of it. And this is a hard reality to grasp, and I know for me, one of the resources that was really helpful for me in working through this idea was a book by Alan Watts called The Wisdom of Insecurity. He wrote it in the 1950s, and yet it is more relevant now, I think, than ever. And you've probably heard me mention Alan Watts a lot, but he was a Zen philosopher and author. And, you might be thinking, The Wisdom of Insecurity, what a counterintuitive title. What is wise about being insecure? But the point that he was making in this book was that when we think of security in life, in the world, we're often actually thinking of this illusion of control, this illusion of the world being unchanging. And so what he described as the wisdom of insecurity is merely the recognition that we live in a world that is changing, that we live in a reality that is inherently fluid. And if we are receptive and existentially flexible to the very nature of reality, it is actually going to lead to a much easier experience of life. And one of the most kind of standout quotes that I think really communicates this idea is this. He says, there is a contradiction in wanting to be perfectly secure in a universe whose very nature is momentariness and fluidity. The idea that we could be secure, that we could experience a lack of change in a universe that's very nature is change, is just quite counterintuitive. And this shows up all over our lives. One example of where this can show up is our faith, is our spiritual outlook. Because if you're like me, you might have grown up with a spiritual outlook that was grounded in certainty, right? Like, I am certain of this truth. This is dogma. Dogma says you must be certain of these ideas, and that's really what defines your faith and your spirituality. But what this has helped me process through is that perhaps it is my certainty that is actually resisting the very flow of reality that is changing, that is fluid, that is always evolving, just as you and I are constantly evolving and changing. And so what I think we need, or at least what can be very helpful, is a way of viewing reality, a frame, a belief system, an ideology, a structure for how we walk through the world and think of the deeper things that has some give, that has some flexibility, that has some openness. And in many ways, this is kind of like the very clothes that we wear. You might have noticed, if you've been in here the last couple weeks, I'm in my big pants era, you know? I realized, I just got to this age where I just realized I only want to wear clothes that are soft, that are loose, that have some give, right? It's my right, you know? I turned 30 and I'm like, I'm out of the rat race, you know? And it kind of actually it started in the pandemic, because, you know, as most of you experienced, right? Like when we transitioned into doing most things remote, you kind of realize, like, why am I putting on the same clothes that I used to wear? And so for me, the distinction that began in the pandemic was not between short pants and long pants. It was between hard pants and soft pants. The pandemic was the beginning of my soft pants era, and I have never left. And the reason this is significant for me is because I used to wear incredibly tight and stiff and rigid pants, okay? So much so that I think I might have permanently damaged my circulation. And the reality, though, why I bring this up is that often our belief systems or our identities can serve to be very rigid and tight clothing that doesn't have give, that doesn't have the generosity and flexibility for the natural experiences of life that we will go through. How many of us know that life will hit you hard, unexpectedly, right? Or at the very least, you will experience doubts of what you thought life was supposed to be, how you thought God or reality was supposed to operate. And very often, when our structures, when our frameworks, when the ways that we've navigated life are tight and are rigid like that tight clothing, we try to fit these experiences. We try to fit these doubts. We try to fit this suffering into this tight clothing. It's almost like an example would be, we're faced with the problem of suffering. Why is there suffering in the world? And we try to fit that into a view of, let's say, God, a God that is kind of removed from reality, that is just looking at reality saying, well, this is what I want to happen, this is what I don't want to happen, like, I'll allow this, I won't allow this, right? Like, I'm going to give this person a parking spot and I'm going to let all these people over in this country die, right? And it's the truth, right? It's a frame that is actually so tight, so narrow, so constricted that we try to fit things into it that simply don't work. And what happens, it's not only does it cut off circulation, it probably will rip. And I know a thing or two about tight clothes ripping, okay? Or there's another option. And this other option is to wear spiritual soft pants or spiritual stretchy pants. To adopt a way of being in the world that has give, right? That's loose, that's open. What does this actually look like practically, though? Perhaps it looks like holding your ideas loosely, that you can be grounded in love, that you could be grounded in your values, in your ethos, and still be open-handed about so many things, still be flexible about many things. Instead of trying to fit these great problems into a box, allow the challenges to mold and even reshape you. I was thinking just about what are some examples of a perspective on life that is flexible in this way. And I was reminded of a song that we sing fairly often here at Aldea. You may have heard it. It's called Let the Mystery Be. I believe in, basically it goes like this. I believe in love and I live my life accordingly. I'm doing this justice, by the way. Where's Bill? He could do it. But I choose to let the mystery be. You know this song, right? We've heard it sometimes. Okay. I looked at this line. It's my favorite line in the song. And what I find about this line is it's a very flexible, generous, forgiving worldview. It says, I believe in love, right? I have grounding in a value, and I live my life accordingly. But all this space, all this flexibility, all this openness, I let the mystery be. Right? It's a very flexible, open, generous way of approaching reality. Because how many of us know that the more rigid your approach, the harder the fall? As Kathleen mentioned, this shows up in trees, right? Like trees actually have this attribute called mechanical flexibility. And mechanical flexibility is a tree's ability to sway and blow and bend in the wind so that it does not break. And we see a high degree of mechanical flexibility in things like willows, palms, or bamboo. They can sway and blow with the wind and remain standing. Meanwhile, trees that have a low degree of mechanical flexibility are things like pine trees or oak trees. This is what happens in the wind with more rigid trees. And this is how we show up in life, right? Like if we are rigid against the wind of life, we're going to get knocked over. But if we are loosey-goosey, right? Someone actually just this morning said, you know what would be a great illustration for today is those blow-up things at car dealerships, you know? If you can just be that thing, right? If you're this and life comes and life, you know, out of nowhere, life gets you, you're just gonna tip right over. But if you're just, you know, thank you. That's it for today. No, I should have imagined if like one day we're gonna have the budget where I'm gonna bring one of those things in here, right? And it's just gonna be like, you know, okay. So what is all this? Like we experience these wins, and we experience unexpected change, and we experience even things like a loss of faith, and we try to be more flexible. But what does this actually mean? And what does it mean about us? Like, what does this say about a person who is trying to live life this way, live it in a spiritual, flexible way? There is a very profound and powerful wisdom text known as the Tao Te Ching. It comes to us from about the 4th century BC. It's attributed to an author named Lao Tzu, a Chinese author. And some people, you know, actually are thinking that perhaps Lao Tzu was the combination of many ideas and sort of a pen name of many people. Regardless, it is an incredibly rich book, wisdom text. It's actually very short and very, I think, easy to read. So if you're like, I want to just, you know, kick out like an entire wisdom tradition in like a week, the Tao Te Ching would be the one to start with because it's pretty short. And basically it just has these really beautiful, simple verses about living life in this fluid and flexible and open way. And one of the powerful descriptions of flexibility in the Tao Te Ching is that it basically says that if you are flexible, you are alive. That if you are flexible, this is a sign that you are a living, breathing, changing, growing, open human being. In chapter 76, these are the words it uses. When alive, the body is soft and pliant. When dead, it is hard and rigid. Living plants are tender and filled with sap. Dead ones are brittle and dry. Therefore, the hard and inflexible are friends of death. The soft and yielding are friends of life. You know, this calls to mind something that is very familiar, a familiar sight to us here in the Southwest. I think of the saguaro cactus even, and the saguaros, which, you know, have some give. Really, you can see them moving with the wind as they are alive, and yet when they die, they become brittle and inflexible. We actually, in our yard, one of our beloved saguaros died and broke in half this week, and we got a lot of awes. Yeah, I know. They're like part of the family, honestly. And it was sad. But one thing I noticed that I'd never seen before is that just after it had split, all this sap came out, and I realized just how alive it was. It was so full of life until that moment. And it reminded me that, yeah, that which is alive is fluid, is flexible. That which is dead is rigid, is inflexible. And it brings to mind this idea of rigor mortis, right? That when a human dies, that their body begins to become very stiff. And don't we all know that you can be physically alive, but spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, you can be dead. You can be inflexible. You can have spiritual rigor mortis. And I think that when we are looking for life to be secure, the things that we are hoping to make secure, this false sense of security we have in our stuff and our status, it's actually a desire for things to be dead, because it's wanting things to be lifeless and unchanging and unmoving. Alan Watts put it this way: the more a thing tends to be permanent, the more it tends to be lifeless. See, for me, this is how I approached spirituality and how I approached God for so many years. My view of God, even my view of life, was built around certainty. It was built around permanency. It was built around things not changing. And I look back and realize just how lifeless this frame was. The reality about impermanence, not only is impermanence just a fundamental truth, which how the universe works, but it's also a sign of life, because you are impermanent. You are different today than you were yesterday, than you were a year ago, than you were 5 years ago. And if you don't think so, just ask the cells in your body, which are constantly dying and being reborn, are constantly changing. I tell this often: every 7 years, every last cell in your body has been traded out. So every 7 years, you've become a whole new you. You are impermanent by definition. And so perhaps the goal is not to fight change, but to move with change. Perhaps the point of life is not to get it all figured out, right? To figure out the things that make you feel the best and then just protect all those things and build a whole life around just, hey, that's my whole world and that's all it's going to be. And instead, maybe life is about developing an approach to survive and even thrive with all that life is going to bring you. Chapter 22 in the Tao, I think, speaks to this. If you want to become whole, let yourself be partial. If you want to become straight, let yourself be crooked. The flexible are preserved, unbroken. There is a reason, friends, that flexibility is a sacred value. And part of this is because flexibility really is self-preservation, that we might bend with life so that life does not break us. Because we live in a world that is exerting intense pressure on us. How many of us feel like weekly, just by looking out at what's going on in the world, that weekly we're pushed to what feels like a breaking point? This is the world we live in. This is the power and the pressure of the wind and the elements that are being exerted on us from a very challenging time in life, in society. We've all heard this term, I hope you don't get bent out of shape over this, right? And I look at this verse of the Tao, and I think, I hope you do get bent out of shape, right? I hope you bend out of shape so you don't break, right? When we look at the world, let the confusion be confusing. Let the madness be maddening. Let the feelings be felt so that you may flow with life rather than fight it, so that you may bend, not break. I think a good example of this, and as I share this example, I'm also just sharing a survival tip. So for those of you who are going to the beaches this summer, here's a little survival tip that I think perfectly illustrates this idea. If you are out swimming and you are caught in a riptide, you are caught in some kind of current that is exerting all this pressure on you and feels like it's pulling you away from where you want to go, the worst thing you could do is fight it, is to try to swim against it, because it will always exert a stronger pressure on you, and you will end up more exhausted and not having gone anywhere. The way to survive a riptide is to allow yourself to be moved by it, and it will ultimately take you someplace down shore, right? And you have to just let it sort of take you. You have to, instead of fighting and resisting, be flexible, be fluid with it. So we bend so that we don't break. There's another way of looking at this, because sometimes we do break. Sometimes our hearts break, and that is also part of life. And another question is, if I'm going to break, am I breaking into more aliveness or less aliveness? A friend recently shared this wonderful line with me. Is your heart breaking closed, or is it breaking open? The breaking is guaranteed. The choice is whether we allow that flexibility and that fluidity to open our hearts from the pain, or to the pain rather, or to close off. Mary Oliver expressed it beautifully. I tell you this, to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world. Our flexibility is a sign of life. Our flexibility is how we flow with pain and with pressure. And our flexibility is how the difficulties of life might actually lead us to be more open than before. But the last thing that the Tao really gives us, a very profound understanding of this way of being, is that perhaps when we adopt this way, this flexibility, this openness, this lack of fight, this lack of resistance, perhaps we are actually accessing a true and deep power, as old as the universe, a strength that is one with the strength of nature. See, the Tao specifically talks about this way of life in terms of water, just as Bruce Lee did before. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it. The soft overcomes the hard, the gentle overcomes the rigid. Everyone knows this is true, yet few can put it into practice. Water is the most soft and yet the most powerful substance on the planet. This is an inherent paradox, right? And I wanted to illustrate this today with a prop. I got to go get the prop. Give me a second. And our prop today, it's really special. Our prop today is water. And the reason I bring water is just to remind you, we all know, but I just want to remind you how water functions, because it has a molecular structure that in all its molecules are so loosely bonded together that it allows water to have this fluidity and this non-resistance. It fully conforms to anything that comes against it. It doesn't resist force, it disperses force. And it can slip through even the tiniest of spaces, which those of you who have spent thousands of dollars fixing a leak in your house, you know this to be true, right? And yet it's the very same structure that allows it to be so yielding and so forgiving in this moment. It's the very same structure that allows it to have incredible power and to overcome even the most strongest of substances. Instead of using my clicker and perhaps electrocuting myself, I'm going to ask Lori to go to the next slide. The same water that is so yielding in this jar is also the same water that created the Grand Canyon. Or if you go to the next one, just the same water that comes together to create the incredible impact of a crashing wave. The paradox here, friends, is that it is the yielding nature of water that allows it to overcome the unyielding. It's resonant of a martial art called Aikido. It's spelled Aikido. And this is a Japanese word for the way of harmonizing energy. And in Aikido, there's never a strike. There's never an attack on your opponent. The goal of Aikido, in fact, is not to harm anyone. The goal is to defuse and deflect the strikes of your opponent. So it's all about redirecting energy away. It's about taking and dispersing force and essentially using the energy of your opponent to end and defuse the conflict. And yet is this incredibly powerful way of moving through the world that really is resonant of this idea of water. So whether we're talking about the power of water, we're talking about the power of an Aikido master, or we're talking about the power of Bruce Lee, who did knock people out. So he's not exactly like Aikido, but he did have this same perspective. It's the same power that you hold when you choose to face things heart open instead of head on, right? When you choose not to fight, but to feel, because the world is changing, no doubt. And the world is changing in many ways that we know are bad. And the world's also changing in some ways that are good, if we have the eyes to see it. And then the world is changing in a lot of ways in which we don't really know quite yet. And the reality is that when we resist, when we are inflexible, we will see and experience all changes as negative. All of these changes will make us miserable. But if we can allow ourselves to expand, to open, to be soft-hearted, there is nothing that we cannot overcome. As the Tao reminds us, the softest thing in the universe overcomes the hardest thing in the universe. That without substance can enter where there is no room. Thus, I know the value of non-action. We're talking about the Tao, which is talking about water, right? But it's really talking about you and I and how we move through the world. And this reality that there is an incredible power in softness, despite how much of a paradox that feels. That perhaps love truly does win. That perhaps kindness and gentleness can truly overcome even the most powerful of forces. I think we see this all the time reflected in our spiritual traditions. We certainly see it in the way of Jesus. Talk about non-action. Jesus met the most powerful military superpower of his day, the Roman Empire. He didn't meet that with an equal and opposite resistance, though there were many in his time who did. But he chose to approach it a completely different way. I think a lot like water and a lot like non-action. He allowed himself to be killed for this very reason, to demonstrate the power of love overcoming, to demonstrate once and for all that this way of power and coercive violence actually doesn't work. And I think he succeeded in that because even though we are still grappling with that message today, it is one that reverberates throughout culture, right? So perhaps flexibility, friends, can be our superpower, where our strength is measured not in how hard we can resist the things happening to us, but on how much we can hold in our hearts. And perhaps our spiritual aliveness is not measured by the degree of certainty that we have, but the degree of open-mindedness and open-heartedness. Recently, I was doing yoga, and as I mentioned before, it's not my strong suit, so it was pretty pathetic. But I was trying to do yoga, and I had this idea come to me that perhaps when we engage in any kind of spiritual practice or we engage in spiritual community, that what we are doing is a stretching of the soul. That we can stretch our body, but we can also stretch our soul. That we can do things that invite our hearts and our souls to remain flexible, to remain open, and to remain limber, right? So perhaps we have things and practices and rhythms and community that we engage in that are kind of like, how compassionate can I be in this situation, right? Or how much can I forgive, right? Oh, these aren't real stretches. Do not try these at home, by the way. Or what else can I do? How much can I let go, And we have these different ways that maybe we're not physically stretching, but we are stretching our souls. And I find that community, and a community like this, is one of the most potent places that we can engage in that work because we are stretching together and supporting each other. And friends, nothing stretches hearts and keeps souls flexible like relationship and like community. So friends, here's my encouragement for us today. Be flexible or be miserable. May you remember that flexibility is a sign of life, that it allows us to bend but not break. And when we do break, that we break open rather than breaking closed. Flexibility holds a power and a strength in even the most subversive and unexpected places like water, so that no matter what we face, there is nothing that love cannot overcome.